We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here.
This is Houston. Say again, please.
Houston, we've had a problem.
G'day and welcome back to this co-video edition of Space Junk Podcast. I am your regular correspondent, the lazy PhD student from Sydney, Annie Handmer, and joining me live is our correspondent from Stockton in northeast England, the fabulous Professor Chris Newman, a Professor of Space Law and Policy at Northumbria University at Newcastle, I believe it's how it's said in the UK. It is fabulous to be speaking to you. Oh, and I should mention also a member of the International Institute of Space Law, which has to be the coolest international institute that exists. It is fabulous to be talking to you, Chris. What a pleasure to have you on the line and to have you here for all of our viewers. How are you going? How is the COVID treating you?
Hey, well, thank you. First, thanks so much for having me on. It's great to speak with you. I've been following your work. I've been following your podcast, and it's absolutely brilliant. To say the lazy PhD student, I think that's a bit disingenuous, because I think the work you're doing in getting space law, space policy, space in society out there, I think is phenomenal. So I will say it's a privilege from my part to be on here. Yeah, it's all a bit strange at the minute, isn't it? The world has a slightly surreal feeling to it. I have not taken this opportunity to take to my pajamas and stay in bed, so you're actually getting me from my office. But, you know, I'm just hoping that everybody is staying safe and looking after themselves and keeping isolated as best we can, because there is a hope that you know, we'll get through this, but it seems a long way off at the minute. So absolutely hoping that everyone's safe and that you're looking after yourself as well.
Absolutely. Now, Chris, you are from, as I mentioned, Northumbria University, which I think is gaining a bit of a name for itself in space law. You've had a number of good PhD students go through, and it's sort of becoming a bit of a centre of space law. Is that right, or is that just the Australian perspective?
No, I think what we're trying to do, I hope you're right, because what we're trying to do is to sort of reorient the law school in a more tech direction. I was brought on board 2.5 years ago by the head of law, Michael Stockdale, with the specific brief of, you know, bringing new and novel but technically relevant areas of law into the law school. So we're doing a master's in space law, we're doing a master's in cyber law, we're doing a master's in communications studies. So we've got a whole range of sort of tech law, how shall I put this? Yeah, tech law programs that we're trying to bring on board. And I'm very, very lucky because we're managing to get some great PhD students. One of my PhD students, Thomas Cheney, has just passed his PhD, is now settling into a lectureship at the Open University. I've got another, Lauren, who's starting to bring international relations into it. I've got Alex Taylor, who's looking and talking about criminal justice theory in outer space and the way in which the harm principle can be applied to outer space activities. And also I'm involved with something called the Space Law Games, with a local sort of firm, Northern Space and Security. And we've managed to secure a joint PhD student who is going to look and try and administer the way in which liability in outer space is dealt with, and try and almost introduce a wargaming methodology and then apply it to legal mooting.
That sounds absolutely fascinating. We'll definitely have to do a Space Junk podcast special on that when that comes about. But in the meantime, tell me, how did you come to become a space lawyer? How did you get into it?
Well, it's interesting thinking about the way in which I got there. It was very much the long way around. I started off, I was a cop. I was a detective down in London doing anti-terrorist work. And I became involved in counter-proliferation work, the prevention of missile technology falling into the hands of people we didn't want. And at the time, it was very much in vogue because it was just after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the Cold War was sort of realigning. So you had all this Soviet tech that was coming onto the sort of the black market, and I became involved in trying to prevent the spread of that. And through that, I became acquainted with various missile control regimes and ITAR. And I came across the Outer Space Treaty, which sort of regulated the way in which activities occurred in outer space. And I thought, well, this is all very interesting. And then I put it out of my mind because I moved from being a cop into legal practice. And I became a solicitor in private practice in the northeast of England. Didn't do an awful lot regarding sort of space law, except I encountered somebody trying to put a patent on some materials that they were looking to use in the space industry. So kind of it came back to me there again. So it's been a question of visiting my house. And then I joined academia. And when I was pulling together my PhD proposal, my PhD is on public order, but it embraces the notion of chaotic constitutionalism. And so I'm looking at the various constitutional solutions in the United Kingdom, in Australia, in Germany, in America. And then I did a discussion on outer space and whether there is a constitutional settlement possible for outer space, what that's going to look like, how it's going to work. And in 2006, as a result of sort of the work I was doing, I thought, well, I'm going to pull together a module on space law. This is something that I think is going to become more and more important. At the time, certainly in the UK, space wasn't a thing. We didn't really, we had pockets of excellence, small satellite manufacturing companies, some real pockets of excellence, but they tended to be coalescing around, 2 or 3 universities. And then we had Airbus and things like that. But really, truly, it's only been in the last sort of 15 years that the UK has really seriously entered the space game. I often think that Australia and the UK are sort of very similar in where they're positioning themselves, both in the space market and in the history of space development. I think the UK has maybe got a couple of years ahead of Australia because we had the Space Agency in 2010. But, you can see a very similar track. They're following a very similar sort of policy-driven, commercial-driven approach to space. So I think it's one of those things. I've been very lucky to be in the right place at the right time. And that's kind of my space law journey as it was. I've taught space law, I've written articles, and I've written a book on Frontiers of Risk in Space, looking at risks from space and risks to space. And in 2017, I was recruited by Northumbria to very much bring space law within the mainstream, because I think that there's Brian Weedner, the Secure World Foundation. I don't know if he invented the phrase, but he very much talks about getting over the giggle factor in space. This thing that whenever I mention to people that I'm a space lawyer, I always get the giggle. What does that involve? And I think the interesting thing that we're trying to do now is say, well, okay, this is just an area of law. If I can say, I might be wrong on this, but I think we are with space law where we were with law and the internet, 25 years ago. So I think it's one of those things where just at the right time, and it's starting to hit mainstream considerations. People are now thinking about space debris. People are now thinking, with Elon Musk and his activities, people are now thinking about not only how do we colonize Mars, but should we colonize Mars? And so I think we're really in that zone of interest where we can start to take the actual administration of outer space into the mainstream as well as the tech stuff.
I would totally agree with that one. The giggle factor thing is really interesting. And I think that people are very fascinated by the concept of space law. I often find that when I talk about my research, people will say, oh, so you're a space lawyer. And I have to say, no, I'm not a space lawyer. I study space law. But look, here are all of these space lawyers I know, and I can put you in contact with them and talk to them. But it is interesting that it's still kind of one of those professions that people think about as made up or just so unusual. But really, for you and I, space law is kind of it's what you do. It's your profession, and so it can't have a giggle factor. In Australia, I think that Stephen Freeland, who likes to say that space and space law is becoming sexy again. And his view is that it was once sexy and it went through a bit of a dip, but it's back. It's back on, people's front of mind. And I think that's true. I do think that's true. And at least I'd hope so.
Yeah, I think as well, we're almost into the next phase of the evolution of space law. I think I would agree with Stephen on pretty much anything, but I particularly agree with him on this, because I think what happened was we went through a phase of space law being, big law. It was international treaties. It was, international agreements. It was all carried out in the shadow of the Apollo rockets, and so it had that very sort of grandiose feel that I think space activity did in the 60s and 70s. It had that big feeling to it, and I think we're now coming on the other side of the curve, where actually I don't see the international treaties moving that much, and actually I would counsel against even trying to do that, because I think of Humpty Dumpty and the Outer Space Treaty. Once we start unpicking it, putting it back together again with all of the different stakeholders, I think is not only going to be very, very difficult, I think is going to be very unwise. I saw, and I won't name names, but I saw somebody prominent in the American military talking about we need to create new norms for outer space. Well, I'm a little confused. You don't just wake up one morning and think, I'm going to create a norm. Norms happen and are an evolutionary process. And that's what we've got with the Outer Space Treaty. We have this evolutionary process that's happened pretty much over the span of human space activity. Now, I think if we start trying to unpick that, we're going down a very dangerous road indeed. So the second phase of space law is looking at the way in which states are doing it, the national space legislation. And that's kind of where I'm very interested and quite active at the minute, and looking and seeing how are the states pulling down their responsibilities from the Outer Space Treaty into domestic legislation.
Yes. And I think one of the big areas where states are starting to get really interested and maybe concerned is around liability. It's who is liable when something goes wrong in space. And when you've got the private sector starting to experiment and try things out and do things, that becomes more and more important. And so that's just a very neat way of me leading into the fact that Chris has selected as the preferred article for our discussion, Article 7 of the Outer Space Treaty, which is all about liability. So I'm going to read it and then we shall discuss. Article 7 states that each state party to the treaty that launches or procures the launching of an object into outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, and each state party from whose territory or facility an object is launched, is internationally liable for damage to another state party to the treaty or to its natural or juridical persons by such object or its component parts on the earth, in the air, or in outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies. So what does this mean?
I always think that with the Outer Space Treaty, I'm going to jump back a few steps. I think with the Outer Space Treaty, what we have is it's a treaty of almost three chunks. In the first chunk, you have the behavioral aspects. You've got to do this, you can't do that, you should do this, astronauts can do that. So Articles 1 to 5, I break up as the behavioral aspect of the Outer Space Treaty. Then you have, we'll leave 6, 7, and 8, because then you have almost the admin side. You have Article 9, you have the due regard principle, you have the consultation, notions of consultation in there. You have all of those elements. And then in the middle, in the core of the Outer Space Treaty, you have this responsibility triangle of Article 6, Article 7, Article 8. And I think you almost could read them together as a core of state responsibility. I mean, I know there's various sort of readings about the history of the Outer Space Treaty, and the USSR wanted this, and the United States wanted to sort out liability in astronauts, and I think that's useful and interesting. But I think we've almost got to say, right, where are we currently with space activity? What do the contours of Article 6 look like? What do the contours of Article 8 look like? And how does Article 7 fit into the middle of all this? So the first thing we have is this notion of sort of almost differentiated responsibilities, with Article 6 making all of the state signatories responsible for the space activity. And Article 7 focusing in that responsibility to introducing the concept of the launching states. Now, we're talking about Article 7. We can't really talk about Article 7 without bringing in the Liability Convention, one of the daughter and sons, if you like, of the Outer Space Treaty. The lex specialis of Article 7 is the Liability Convention, which sort of clarifies and augments the liability regime and puts in place dispute resolution mechanisms, firms up the contours of what Article 7 looks like, gives us what launching states are, gives us what space objects are. So in essence, we have this notion that damage caused by space objects on the surface of the Earth and to aircraft in flight, that's absolute liability. An immensely onerous form of liability. We're not interested in causation. We're not interested in fault. We're not interested in anything. All we're interested in is the piece of space object A causes damage, B, there we are. You're in play. That's it. It doesn't matter. It wasn't my fault. There's a load of intervening factors. We don't care. That's yours. That causes the damage. You're liable. And the notion, you can see the security sort of ethos of the treaty running through the provisions, because we have damage on the Earth or aircraft in flight. The concept, the feelings of the players and the negotiators at the time, that space technology and spacecraft technology could be used as anti-aircraft measures. So we'll put that in there to make sure that any damage caused to aircraft in flight is covered by this absolute liability as well. And then we have the damage in space. So we have the two regimes. We have the regime on planet Earth and aircraft, and anything basically below the Kármán line, any damage caused below the Kármán line is damage according to the Article 2 of the Liability Convention. Then we have the next liability, the damage caused in space. And there's a number of ways in which I find this particularly interesting. The proof factor. Thinking as a practical lawyer, or thinking as a former investigator, my spacecraft was caused damage by your spacecraft. Okay, how are we going to prove that? How are we going to show that? Is it going to be possible? What are the contours of evidence gathering? What's that going to look like? How are we going to ascertain liability in that case? Because we've got to show that damage was caused. How do we show that it wasn't caused by something else? Then we have the notion of state-on-state liability, rather than company A and company B. The reality of space activity is that it's companies that are going up there and doing a lot of this. So we have this notion, this it feels quite arcane, of state A being liable for damage to state B. But actually, the reality of modern space activity is it's going to be Corporation A, Corporation B, Corporation C, each of which might have different jurisdictions at play, one of which might not be a launching state, one of which might just have hired the satellite for usage, but might be using it for, might be getting a lot of money out of it and suffering damage. Then thrown into the mix, we've also got the insurance market as well. We've also got the practicalities of insurance in space. Now, that is a market that is going through a considerable trauma at the minute as well. The geo market has I don't want to say collapse, that would be too dramatic, but it's gone through some significant changes. LEO market isn't quite as lucrative as insurance companies would have hoped for. So we've got an where there's liability, you would hope there would be an insurance regime, and we don't have that just yet. So I've kind of gone a long way around there, and I apologize. I'll pause for breath in a minute. But I think we have, reading Article 7 in the modern context, we have so many questions that I think are firing up from that. Specifically, the notion of, okay, it's fault-based. It's a fault-based liability regime in orbit, or anywhere other than the surface of the Earth or the aircraft in flight. It is a fault-based regime. So how does that look like? What does fault look like? How do we establish fault for completely novel space operations? I'm thinking about on-orbit servicing. Well, we've had, the Northrop Grumman mission extension vehicle. We've had one kind of iteration of that. We can't claim to have best practice in that. I know we've got confers that are trying to develop guidelines and develop sort of ways of working, but we haven't got that yet. So that's an area that's particularly of interest as well, I think, to space lawyers as space activity continues to develop its commercial face.
I think that's an incredibly good summary of a lot of really complicated law. I'll say two things on it, and then I want to throw back to you and ask you more questions. But the first one is that if you are watching this or listening to this and you have not yet read in its entirety the Liability Convention, I will be putting up, and probably by the time this video goes up, it will be up. There is a video recording of me sitting with a cup of tea and reading the entirety of the Liability Convention to you. So if you're feeling like you don't want to read, you just want to be spoken at, you can experience the whole of the Liability Convention in an authentic Australian accent. In fact, you could experience all 5 of the major treaties being read to you by me with a cup of tea, which I believe no one has ever done.
I'm only disappointed. I'm only disappointed there isn't a musical version.
A musical version?
I'm just putting it out there.
I'll put a backing of some soft jazz underneath all of it. And the second thing I was going to say is, now I've forgotten what the second thing I was going to, yes. The second thing I was going to say is that in every conversation that I've had with a space lawyer about the Outer Space Treaty over the last week, and more generally, the same question keeps coming up, which is the Outer Space Treaty outdated? And it's so fascinating to me that even within the space law community, people who work on the law and work in the policy, there is such a diversity of opinions on that question. There are some people who say, well, the law is that the old Outer Space Treaty was for a time. It was for 1967. It sort of prevented that nuclear disaster. It did its job, but really it's very outdated and we need to tear it up and start again. All the way through to people who, I know I'd probably count myself more among them, who say, actually, the Outer Space Treaty is visionary, brilliant, perfect for our time, exactly the principles that we need. And all that we need to do is take precisely what's here and sort of expand on it a little bit. And there you've got it. You've got the perfect regime in outer space. And I'm interested because when I read this, right, Article 6 to me says governments are responsible for activities in space, whether that's done by governments or by non-governmental agencies. Yep. They're responsible. So it's their responsibility to make sure that's fine. Article 7 says when you're a launching state, you've got liability. And then Article 8 says basically once you have ownership of or jurisdiction over a thing that you put in space, you have jurisdiction over it and you have responsibility for it in perpetuity until such a time as it is no longer in existence. And so those 3 principles that come out, as you say, in this central chunk, and I'm now feeling regretful that I only allocated sort of Article 7. We really should have gone the 3, 6, 7, and 8, but we are doing that now, and I'll update the description accordingly. But to me, those principles are still incredibly relevant. If you think about how do you actually govern this enormous area that everyone has access to, that is so useful to everyone, to me, those 3 principles sound perfectly reasonable and a very good basis on which to develop not only the Liability Convention, which expands on all of that, but a whole lot of guidelines on how we do things and a bunch of domestic space law. But am I being too Pollyanna-ish about this law? I mean, am I being too affectionate? Do you think that it does need a bit of a refresh?
I think you can actually go the other way and think it's a very pragmatic approach to work with the Outer Space Treaty, because the chances of getting something else as widely accepted are virtually zero. You know, yes, it was top-down imposition by the 2 space powers, but it had to be, because when it was conducted, as you know, the only way to get into space was a superpower budget. So yes, it was top-down imposition, but it's actually been broadly accepted that the regime, whilst it's been criticised, I don't think the criticisms have focused on the Outer Space Treaty regime itself. I think what they're focused on is what isn't there in the Outer Space Treaty. So no enforcement mechanisms. Well, fine, okay. But that's what national regulators are for. See Article 6. So we've got a regime here that is, I think almost to call it space. This is kind of where I think that the problem lies. When we say law, we think about prohibitions on behavior, we think about appropriate sanctions, we think about prescriptive behavior and proscriptive behavior, and the Outer Space Treaty doesn't really do that. What the Outer Space Treaty does is lay down the foundational principles and the contours of human activity in outer space. And it then says there are these broad areas that we're going to agree on. We can all agree that there shouldn't be nuclear weapons in outer space and weapons of mass destruction. No need to revisit that. We can all agree that international law is part of outer space, and the ordinary principles that we've established in international law on Earth apply to outer space. We would agree that international humanitarian law should stretch out into outer space. Where it tends to focus on is the non-appropriation. But the only reason it focuses on non-appropriation is because it makes us pause a while and think about the difficult bits of how do we actually administer regimes, for example, in regard of, celestial mining. How do we do that? The Outer Space Treaty says we can use space, we can explore space, we can scientifically investigate in space. That's the limitation that the treaty imposes on us. Well, that's fine though, isn't it? Because again, I don't think anybody would argue with that. So when you unpick the Outer Space Treaty regime, actually, the areas of disagreement go to areas that aren't in existence, the lack of enforcement, the lack of support for commercial activities. Well, commercial activities are supported by Article 6. Because it's the national regulators who then take on the mantle of overseeing the activity and say, right, is it broadly within the Outer Space Treaty confines? If the answer is yes, then they can do it. So I actually think rather than being Pollyanna, we're being very pragmatic about it and saying we've got something that works. It doesn't work particularly well. There are areas where it has been legitimately criticized. The environmental provisions are zero. So that if I was going to beef up anything, that's what I'd beef up. But actually, we've got the mechanisms of the ongoing, supervision, the authorization in Article 6. We can use that. We can say to states, okay, it's up to you to regulate the behavior of those who are acting in space. I mean, we look at, I am going to drift off my brief a little bit. In Article 6, state parties to the treaty shall bear international responsibility for national activities in outer space. Now, again, there's a phrase we can unpick. Does that mean national activities as a coherent whole, or does it mean the activities of nationals? How are we going to, to interpret that meaning? And I think what the Outer Space Treaty does is it puts in place a series of binding principles that everybody who goes into space agrees to. And that's, I think, its real strength. As I say, I would not unpick the Outer Space Treaty. I would leave it because I think it forms the foundational basis of it. I'm happy for states to make their own law. I think that's a great way to do it because it reflects the individual focus of each state and their own individual policies as well. So I think there's a number of areas where the Outer Space Treaty serves us well, and I think we would amend and or jettison at our peril. I think space activity would be the poorer for it.
Can I ask you a series of rapid fire legal questions that people ask me about space stuff?
Okay. I might not know the answer.
That's okay, because at the moment I sort of say, well, I think it's this, but ask a real space lawyer, and here you are. So what if a piece of space junk falls on my head as I'm walking down the street? Who is liable?
So you've got that's classic, lovely Article 7 liability for the space object of the launching state. So the launching state would be the liable because it's a nice absolute liability as well. So you wouldn't have to prove, you wouldn't have to get into arguments of fault if you could identify that piece of space object was from that launching state. Then you would have the liability confirmed. The problem with that is you wouldn't be able to sue. You'd have to get your state to sue their state. Right. And interstate litigation is, well, ordinary litigation is expensive, and time consuming. So you can imagine how time consuming and how expensive state against state litigation is.
Right. I mean, when people ask me this question, I give them roughly that same answer. And then I go further and say, do you really think the Australian government is going to take America to task on the fact that a piece of space debris from 1970 fell on your head while you're walking down the street? Assuming that you're fine, I think they're probably not going to bother.
Yeah, which would go back to my point earlier on about the theoretical limits of the Outer Space Treaty and the theoretical dimensions of the Liability Convention. But what do you really want? You really want some, if it falls on your car, you want your bonnet fixing or you want your roof fixing. You want money back. This is where the insurance regime comes in. Because I think without that, people aren't going to get the redress that they actually really want. Now, I'm not suggesting a specific bespoke regime to protect us from space objects falling on our heads, because I think chances of that are small, and insurance for that wouldn't necessarily work. But I do think it points back to what the real aim of that is to get recompense, to be sort of to receive a remedy for it.
Well, interestingly, Amy Insurance, which is an Australian brand of insurance, ran a radio ad last year sometime, saying that if space junk fell on your house, you'd be covered. And it was sort of a funny, quirky thing that they threw into a radio ad. And I ended up reaching out to them and saying, is this actually true? Because I wanted to know what their mathematical model was for assessing the risk and then how they costed that. And they basically came back to me and they said, look, it is covered. It's definitely covered, but we don't currently price it in because we think it's so unlikely, we haven't bothered doing any maths on it. But you are covered for it, which I found really interesting. And it's sort of a nice thing to know.
Yeah, exactly. You have that coverage. And again, the insurance companies, I always go back to the Ford company in 1958, where the salesman walks into the first day, and the guy says, what do we make at Ford? And the young salesman put his hand up and he says, we make motor cars. And he went, no, son, we make money. And that's the same with insurance companies, and it's the same with companies going into space. There is a lot of rhetoric about the vision of space exploration, blah blah. If there's a company going into space, they're going into space because they can make money out of it, and that's where the insurance dimension comes in as well.
On that subject, my question number 2 for you is, what's stopping Elon Musk or Richard Branson or any of the Jeff Bezos, any of these really big, powerful, wealthy individuals from going rogue and doing whatever they want in space? What's stopping Musk from claiming the moon?
I've got 2 answers for you. The first answer, nothing. There is nothing stopping them. Because then we reach the limits and we reach the stretch points of the international law regime. What are we actually going to do? Are we going to go to war with America because we don't like Elon Musk building a big rocket? Of course we're not. So we're reaching the limits of the softer power elements here. The thing that I think we're seeing, and looking across regulators across the world, one of the fears is that we will get regulators involved in a race to the bottom to try and get companies to go and work with them. Now, there are some jurisdictions that are doing that, but actually we're seeing a lot of jurisdictions push back on that and want to be seen as responsible space operators. I hate to say this because it sounds like I'm sort of a stooge for the UK government, and I am absolutely not. I have no connection to the space agency. I have no connection to the UK government. But I think the UK kind of gets it right. We're trying to be a responsible regulator. We're trying to show that we're actually interested in balancing the space environment concerns with the commercial sort of imperatives that exist. And I think that's where the answer lies. The answer lies within the regulators themselves. It lies within our trust and our hope that regulators and that people involved in national space activities will rein in the slightly more, shall we say, adventurous elements here. Because you're right, we saw it with the Bereshit probe, where they put tardigrades in and didn't tell the regulator. We saw it with the swarm and the lack of licensing, so they went to another regulator and got it into space. We are seeing transgressions of what we would accept as space law. But I think we have to rely on, this is why the Outer Space Treaty is such, I think, a powerful international regime, because actually it trickles it down to the states, and it gives the states the responsibility to act as the police officer of space activity.
Which, frankly, I feel they have anyway, and they ought to be exercising. When people ask me this question, I often say it boils down to a question of, is any one company or any one individual so powerful that they cannot be regulated by a national government? And the answer to that is maybe. I mean, maybe companies like Facebook and Google and some of the big banks and so on are so big that, you know, they're too big to fail, they're too big to jail, all of that sort of thing. But that's actually not unique to space. That's a broader problem. And that's a problem. It's not a space issue where the Outer Space Treaty has to magically fix it somehow, even though I think it does a great job of doing it in Article 6 and saying, actually, that's the responsibility of the national government to regulate them. And if the national government refuses to, or is scared to, or cannot regulate them, then that's a big issue that I think that we all have to reckon with. It's not just a space law problem.
Annie, I think you have hit the nail on the head there. And it's the same actually when we're looking at the regulation of the cyber world. It's the same as when we're looking at the regulation of this. A lot of these problems have fancy dress and real, nice technical dimensions to them. But a lot of them just boil down to simple bad behavior. And bad behavior is bad behavior, whether it's in an extraterrestrial environment, whether it's ignoring guidelines on, planetary protection, whether it's ignoring guidelines on content, whether it's turning a blind eye to hackers in your country, whether, however it is, bad behavior is bad behavior. You think about surveillance, and I'm stealing from Toby Walsh here, the artificial intelligence guy, things listening to you in your room masquerading as Alexa. Listening to people without their permission is bad behavior. It has a tech dimension, but it's still bad behavior. And I think one of the fundamental issues we have is with space law and with space activity, we still don't quite know why we're doing it. You ask 15 people why we're going to space, you'll get 15 answers. You might get a riff on the same answer, but there'll be different ideas and different impressions. And this is where, going deep legal theory for a moment, there's no communal sort of a nation, for example, has a series of constitutional principles by which all of the citizens generally agree to be bound to, or they move to another jurisdiction, right? Or they can't move to another jurisdiction and they become, but essentially that there is, that the constitutional underpinnings. We don't have that in space. We don't have a universally agreed constitutional underpinning here. The closest we've got is the Outer Space Treaty, which lays out these foundational principles. So again, going back to the question of should we reframe the Outer Space Treaty? But I think it's kind of too late, because we've now got the principles of non-nuclear weapons. We've got the principles of usage and free usage, and the province of humankind. I would change the gendered language in the Outer Space Treaty. I don't like mankind. I'd change it to humankind. But I think we can do that anyway, can't we?
Well, interestingly, it's only gendered in the English version. I was fascinated recently when I was reading the Moon Agreement again, and I was so off put by all of the mankind references and manned bases and so on. I went and checked the Chinese version and the French version, because they're the only languages I could kind of get into, and I had a brief look at the Russian and then decided my Russian was nowhere near good enough. But they weren't gendered in the same way. It's the French version uses sort of the term inhabited rather than manned. And I think it's only the English that has that. And given that the treaties say that all of the languages are equally correct and legitimate, I think that we do have a perfect right to go through and change some of that to non-gendered.
I think we can translate it into 2020.
Yeah,
that's how we'll get around it. But I do think that the OST. I'm hesitant to call it a constitution because I don't think it's quite there yet. There are certain, there are certain things that we would need for it to be a constitution that I don't think we quite have. But nonetheless, there are these foundational principles therein that I think make the Outer Space Treaty valuable of itself. There's discussion as to whether it's customary international law or not. I know international lawyers who would laugh uproariously at the notion of custom, for something that's only been going on for the length of time that space activity has been going on. But I don't think actually that matters. Again, I think that's an interesting theoretical point, but in reality, the bones of the Outer Space Treaty is accepted as being normative behavior in outer space, and I think that's where its value comes from. So that then feeds into the second question of, what if a supervillain decides to go and land on Mars and and drinks all the water at the polar ice cap, etc., etc. What do we do on that? And that's where we start to discover our common interests in outer space, and that's where we define these basic underlying values. Because I think most people, most states, most organizations would think that that's wrong. I don't think that, we can't quite put our finger on why, but I think most people would point to that and say, that doesn't feel right. So we already have these underlying notions there. So how would we stop it? I think we would stop it by the sheer force of public opinion and governmental opinion. And so that's how the Outer Space Treaty, that's its value. That's its integral value to the space community.
Thank you so much. I feel like we should probably leave it there, on the basis that I could keep going all night, but I shouldn't take all of your time. But I think that was, well, I thoroughly enjoyed that conversation. I hope you did too. But
Me too, very much.
For our viewers who are sitting at home and probably hopefully self-isolating, are there any books that you would recommend that they read if they want to know more about any of the things that we discussed, or just more broadly, any books you'd recommend?
Absolutely. My go-to guides, my sacred texts on the Outer Space Treaty, the Cologne commentaries. I have them here actually. My Cologne commentaries, which if I'm talking about the Outer Space Treaty, or if I'm thinking about the offshoot treaties, the Cologne commentaries on space law are absolutely invaluable. They're not the definitive word. There's areas that they can sort of they need updating, but goodness me, they're great. I also think there's a book which can I say a book which I've contributed to chapter 2, because I feel very I feel very sort of
to the one that you wrote, so go forth on it.
There's a book called The Ethics of Space Exploration, and it's a really interesting read on the broader philosophical dimensions of how space activity is being shaped. And I think it's a really fantastic book. It's edited by James Schwartz, and I think it's really something that I would recommend, because it provides a fascinating counterpoint to the hard legal discussions on state liability and contours of liability and responsibility and what a launching state means. It provides a much more philosophical discussion. Tony Milligan and James Schwartz, and it's called The Ethics of Space Exploration. And I've written a small chapter on how I think that essentially, going back to what we were talking about in terms of the value system, that I think we should have an underpinning ecological and environmental value as we go into outer space, almost have the brain surgeon's maxim of do no harm. But there's a whole range of fascinating discussions in there, so I would recommend that as well. Of course, Bin Cheng's book, Studies in International Space Law, for the history of the negotiations, I think is a fascinating book to read as well.
Brilliant. I will link to all of those in the description under this video. And if you're listening to this as a podcast, in the description on the podcast app, you should be able to find links to all of these books, and also to Chris Newman's book that he mentioned earlier in our discussion. He won't like that I'm doing that, but I'm going to insist and put that one in there too. Well, thank you so much.
Annie, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and a real pleasure to talk with you.